I used to think every story gave its hero one fair chance. I was wrong. Some stories hand you the role of the forgotten extra, then dare you to survive anyway. The first thing I noticed was the scent of old cedar drifting through the room, followed by the weight of an unfamiliar silver pendant resting against my chest. Then came the realization that the ceiling above me wasn't my apartment ceiling anymore. Intricate carvings covered dark wooden beams, sunlight poured through tall arched windows, and expensive curtains swayed in a breeze carrying the distant sound of bells. My heartbeat slowed for exactly 1 second before every memory crashed into me at once. My old life, my last ordinary morning, the novel I had stayed up reading until almost 3 in the morning, and the cruel ending that had left me frustrated enough to complain that the forgotten Omega deserved better. I remembered every chapter because the story had fascinated me for all the wrong reasons. The Empire worshipped strength, and the Alpha King named Adrian Blackwood stood above everyone else, respected for his wisdom, discipline, and impossible composure. Hidden beneath the political conflicts and royal ceremonies was another tragedy almost no reader cared about. A nameless Omega quietly disappeared before the middle of the novel, barely mentioned again except for one sentence describing how history forgot him. That Omega was me now, or rather, the body I had awakened inside. Ethan Carter. The villain's neglected adopted Omega whose existence had never mattered to anyone. My stomach tightened as unfamiliar memories settled into place beside my own. Years spent avoiding attention. Meals eaten alone. Birthdays ignored. Servants forgetting my name. None of those memories carried hatred. They carried something worse. Complete indifference. In this palace, disappearing wasn't an event. It was routine. I climbed carefully from the bed and caught my reflection inside a polished mirror standing near the window. Pale skin, soft silver blonde hair brushing my forehead, blue eyes filled with confusion that slowly transformed into disbelief. This was exactly how I had imagined Ethan while reading, except now he wasn't fictional anymore. He looked painfully real. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Panic would accomplish nothing. I knew this world. I knew its timeline. Most importantly, I knew exactly when everything would begin collapsing. The original story wasn't supposed to reach its first major turning point for another 3 weeks. That meant I still had time. Time to stay invisible. Time to avoid every important character. Time to survive. My entire strategy became clear within seconds. Don't attract attention. Don't interfere with the plot. Don't meet Adrian Blackwood. The Alpha King belonged at the center of history while I belonged somewhere no one would remember. If I stayed small enough, perhaps fate would lose interest in me. That comforting thought lasted less than 5 minutes. A quiet knock echoed through the door before an elderly attendant stepped inside, offering a respectful bow that looked more like habit than sincerity. His Majesty has requested every resident of the Western Palace to attend today's Royal Garden ceremony. My pulse nearly stopped. That ceremony wasn't supposed to involve Ethan. It never had in the original novel. Yet the invitation rested in the attendant's hands as though it had always been meant for me. I accepted the sealed envelope with fingers that suddenly felt cold. The wax crest of the royal family shimmered beneath the morning light, beautiful and impossible to ignore. Somewhere beyond these walls, the story I remembered had already begun changing, and for the first time since opening my eyes in this unfamiliar world, I realized the most terrifying possibility of all. I hadn't simply reincarnated into the novel I once knew. Somehow, the novel had started rewriting itself the moment I arrived. The fastest way to survive a story is to stop believing you can control it. I repeated that thought to myself while following the stone path toward the royal gardens, hoping it would quiet the growing uneasiness in my chest. Everything around me looked exactly as I remembered from the novel, yet every step reminded me that the smallest detail had already changed. Ethan Carter had never been invited to this ceremony. He had never received a royal seal. He had never been expected to stand among nobles, advisors, and honored guests. The invitation alone was enough to tell me that the future I knew was already slipping away. The palace gardens stretched across several acres, filled with flowering trees, marble fountains, and carefully trimmed hedges that formed elegant patterns visible from the upper balconies. Servants carried silver trays filled with tea and fresh fruit, while musicians performed soft melodies that blended with the sound of flowing water. Everyone smiled with practiced grace, but beneath every polite greeting was careful observation. Every conversation carried hidden meaning. Every glance measured status. This was not simply a gathering. It was a stage where influence quietly shifted from one person to another. I lowered my eyes and blended into the outer edge of the crowd exactly as Ethan's memories suggested he always had. Becoming invisible was surprisingly easy when people had spent years pretending you did not exist. Several nobles looked directly through me without the slightest sign of recognition. A pair of attendants walked past while discussing upcoming trade agreements, never noticing that they had nearly bumped into me. For a brief moment, relief settled over me. Perhaps my plan could still work. If everyone continued ignoring me, I could remain nothing more than another quiet face inside the palace until the dangerous events passed. Then I heard something that made my confidence disappear. Two young officials standing nearby spoke in hushed voices about strange rumors spreading throughout the capital. They claimed the royal archives had recently recorded unusual discrepancies in old family records. Dates no longer matched. Names had appeared where they had never existed before. One official laughed and blamed careless scribes, but the other looked genuinely unsettled. According to him, even the palace historians could not explain why certain documents seemed to have rewritten themselves overnight. My hands instinctively tightened around the sleeve of my formal robe. I was not the only thing that had changed. The world itself appeared to be adjusting. Around my arrival, quietly correcting details no one else could remember differently. That realization sent a chill through me far stronger than the cool spring breeze. Before I could think further, a sudden movement near the central fountain caught everyone's attention. Royal guards stepped aside with perfect precision as the guests immediately straightened their posture. The atmosphere transformed in an instant, becoming quieter without anyone needing to request silence. I did not need to look up to know who had arrived. Adrian Blackwood. Even before I saw him, I recognized the effect his presence had on everyone around him. Respect did not follow him because people feared him. It followed because they trusted him. That had always been one of the reasons readers admired his character. Slowly, I lifted my eyes just enough to confirm what I already knew. Tall, composed, and dressed in dark ceremonial clothing embroidered with silver thread, Adrian moved through the garden with calm confidence, acknowledging greetings with quiet courtesy instead of arrogance. Nothing about him resembled the distant ruler described by foreign kingdoms. He looked attentive, thoughtful, and unexpectedly approachable. For one dangerous second, I understood why so many characters had willingly placed their faith in him. Then I remembered my own rule. Do not meet him. Do not speak to him. Do not become part of his story. I immediately turned away and chose a narrow garden path leading toward a quieter section filled with blooming white roses. Escaping unnoticed should have been simple. Unfortunately, fate seemed determined to disagree. As I rounded the corner, I noticed a young child standing alone near a decorative pond, reaching toward a folded paper lantern drifting just beyond the stone edge. Without thinking, I stepped forward and gently retrieved it before the breeze carried it farther across the water. The child smiled brightly and thanked me with complete innocence. At that exact moment, another shadow stopped beside us. A calm, familiar voice spoke only a few feet away. That was kind of you. Every instinct told me not to look back because somehow, against every plan I had made, the Alpha King had spoken directly to me. My greatest mistake was believing that destiny always announced itself with thunder when sometimes it arrived as quietly as a simple conversation. I slowly turned around, careful to keep my expression calm despite the panic racing through my mind. Adrian Blackwood stood only a few feet away, his attention fixed on the paper lantern now safely resting in the child's hands. Up close, he looked even more composed than the novel had described. His posture carried quiet confidence instead of pride, and his calm blue eyes reflected genuine concern as he made certain the child had not wandered too close to the edge of the pond. The little boy bowed enthusiastically before running toward his family, leaving the two of us standing beneath the shade of blooming cherry trees. This was wrong. Every part of this moment was wrong. In the original story, Adrian never visited this corner of the gardens. Ethan never exchanged a single word with him. I lowered my head respectfully and prepared to leave before the conversation could continue. "Thank you for helping him," Adrian said with a gentle smile. Many guests noticed the child, yet only one person stepped forward. I answered carefully, choosing words that revealed nothing about myself. "Anyone would have done the same, Your Majesty." Adrian studied me for a brief moment before quietly replying, "Not everyone does." There was no accusation in his voice, only honest observation. That somehow made the situation even more uncomfortable. I offered another respectful bow and took a step backward. "If Your Majesty will excuse me." Before I could leave, a soft breeze swept through the garden, carrying the scent of fresh flowers across the stone path. At the same instant, the silver pendant resting beneath my collar slipped free, catching the sunlight for only a heartbeat before settling against my chest. Adrian's expression changed almost imperceptibly. His eyes remained calm, yet something inside them sharpened with unmistakable recognition. He glanced at the pendant, then back at my face as though comparing two pieces of an impossible puzzle. I instinctively tucked the pendant back beneath my clothing, silently wishing I had noticed the chain loosening earlier. The pendant itself meant nothing to Ethan. According to his memories, it had always belonged to him. A simple keepsake left by someone he had never known. It had never been mentioned in the novel. At least I thought it had not. Adrian spoke again, this time more thoughtfully than before. "May I ask where you received that pendant?" My heart skipped. There was no safe answer because I genuinely did not know. "It has always been with me," I replied truthfully. "I do not know where it came from." Adrian remained silent. Instead of questioning me further, he looked toward the distant palace tower as though recalling an old memory that refused to fade. His normally composed expression softened into quiet contemplation. "Interesting," he murmured almost to himself. "Very interesting." The silence between us stretched long enough for my uneasiness to grow. Fortunately, another royal advisor approached, carrying several official documents that required Adrian's immediate attention. Before leaving, he looked back at me once more. "What is your name?" For one brief second, I considered giving a false name. The idea disappeared as quickly as it came. Lying to the ruler of the empire was unlikely to improve my situation. "Ethan Carter, Your Majesty." Adrian repeated my name slowly, as though committing it to memory. "Ethan." He gave a polite nod before following the advisor toward the main pavilion. I remained frozen beneath the trees until they disappeared from sight. Only then did I finally release the breath I had been holding. I should have felt relieved that the conversation had ended peacefully. Instead, an uncomfortable certainty settled deep inside me. Adrian had remembered my name. That alone was enough to rewrite the future. As I quietly left the garden, I noticed whispers beginning to spread among nearby attendants. None of them had heard our conversation, yet several had clearly seen the Alpha King stop to speak with an Omega whom almost no one inside the palace had acknowledged for years. Curious glances followed me across every walkway. The invisible life I had worked so hard to preserve had vanished in less than 5 minutes. Later that evening, as the last light of sunset faded beyond the palace windows, a neatly folded letter bearing the royal crest was delivered directly to my room. Inside was only one sentence written in elegant handwriting. "His Majesty requests your presence for breakfast tomorrow morning." I stared at the words in complete disbelief because I remembered with absolute certainty that no such invitation had ever existed in the story I once believed I knew. Sometimes surviving means walking directly into the trap because refusing the invitation is even more dangerous than accepting it. I barely slept that night, replaying every chapter of the novel in my mind, searching for a scene that matched the letter resting on the small wooden table beside my bed. Nothing fit. Adrian Blackwood had never invited Ethan Carter to breakfast. They had never shared a private conversation. The forgotten Omega was supposed to remain exactly that, forgotten. Yet when the morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, the royal invitation remained painfully real. Refusing a direct request from the Alpha King would attract attention from the entire palace, while accepting it risked changing the future even further. Neither choice offered safety. I dressed in the simplest formal clothing Ethan owned, carefully choosing a pale gray outfit that blended into the background rather than standing out among the wealthier nobles. If I could keep the conversation short, perhaps Adrian would lose interest once he realized I was nothing special. An attendant escorted me through a series of quiet hallways that gradually became more elegant the closer we came to the eastern wing of the palace. Large windows overlooked gardens sparkling with morning dew, and portraits of previous rulers lined the polished walls. Everything reflected discipline instead of extravagance. Even before entering the dining room, I understood why the empire admired its king. Nothing here existed merely for display. Every detail served a purpose. The doors opened without announcement. Adrian was already seated near a tall window, reading several reports while a cup of tea rested beside him. He looked up the moment I entered and closed the folder with calm efficiency before offering a polite smile. "Good morning, Ethan. Thank you for accepting my invitation." His voice carried no trace of superiority, making it surprisingly difficult to remain nervous. I returned a respectful bow. "Thank you for receiving me, Your Majesty." He gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Please, there is no need to stand." I hesitated for only a second before sitting exactly as palace etiquette required. A servant quietly placed breakfast before both of us before leaving the room, closing the doors with almost perfect silence. To my surprise, Adrian did not begin asking personal questions. Instead, he spoke about ordinary topics: the unusually warm spring weather, the palace gardens, the children's education program that had recently expanded into smaller villages across the empire. Every subject felt natural, almost casual, yet I slowly realized something unsettling. He was observing how I answered rather than what I answered. Every response seemed to confirm or dismiss a question that existed only inside his own mind. Finally, Adrian reached for a small leather journal resting beside his reports. He opened it carefully and turned it toward me. Inside was a faded drawing of a silver pendant nearly identical to the one hidden beneath my collar. My heartbeat immediately quickened. "Have you ever seen this illustration before?" he asked. I forced myself to answer honestly. "No, Your Majesty." Adrian nodded slowly, as though expecting exactly that response. "This sketch was made almost 20 years ago by the royal historian. It depicts an heirloom connected to an old legend that most people believe is only folklore now." My fingers tightened slightly beneath the table. The pendant had never been part of the original novel. I was certain of it, which meant either I had overlooked something important or the story itself had expanded beyond what any reader had known. Adrian continued speaking in the same calm tone. "According to the legend, 2 matching pendants were created generations ago. One disappeared long before my grandfather became king. The other has remained inside the royal archives ever since." He paused briefly before looking directly into my eyes. "Yesterday, when I saw yours, I thought for a moment that I was looking at the missing piece." Silence settled between us. I wanted to explain that I knew nothing about the pendant, yet something stopped me. Adrian was not treating me like a suspect. He genuinely wanted answers. Before I could respond, a sharp knock interrupted the conversation. A senior advisor entered carrying several sealed documents, his expression unusually tense. He apologized for disturbing breakfast before informing Adrian that another section of the royal archives had changed overnight. Family records, historical maps, and even official correspondence now contained names and events that no scholar remembered writing. Adrian stood immediately, his composed expression replaced by thoughtful concern. He glanced once toward me before accepting the reports. In that brief moment, I noticed something that made my pulse race even faster than the strange announcement itself. One of the rewritten documents lying on top of the stack displayed my full name in elegant black ink, followed by words that had never existed in the novel I remembered: "Royal companion under special protection." The most frightening mysteries are not the ones hidden in darkness, but the ones that slowly replace the truth you thought you remembered. My eyes remained fixed on the document even after the advisor carefully gathered the stack against his chest. The words had been visible for only a second, yet they echoed inside my mind with impossible clarity. Royal Companion under Special Protection. That title had never existed in the novel. Ethan Carter had never possessed any official status beyond being an overlooked member of a disgraced household. If the Royal Archives now recognized me differently, then history itself was continuing to reshape around every choice I made. Adrian noticed the concern on my face and quietly dismissed the advisor with instructions to secure the rewritten records inside the archive until scholars could examine them together later that afternoon. Once the doors closed, again, he returned his attention to me instead of the reports. "You look troubled," he observed. I hesitated before answering. "Your Majesty, does the palace often experience unusual changes like this?" Adrian gave a thoughtful smile that suggested he appreciated the careful wording of my question. "No. That is precisely why I am taking them seriously." He folded his hands calmly on the table. "Some members of the court believe careless historians are making errors. Others believe the records are correcting forgotten mistakes from previous generations. Personally, I do not find either explanation convincing." I remained silent, allowing him to continue. "History should preserve the past," Adrian said quietly. "It should not rewrite itself overnight." His words carried the same uncertainty that had been growing inside me since I awakened in this world. For the first time, I realized I was not facing the mystery alone. Adrian was searching for answers just as desperately, even if he concealed it behind his composed expression. Before either of us could speak again, the chief librarian requested permission to enter. An elderly woman with silver hair stepped into the room carrying an aged wooden box protected by several intricate locks. She greeted Adrian respectfully before placing the box upon the table. "Your Majesty, this item appeared inside the restricted archive this morning," she explained. "None of our inventory records listed it yesterday." Adrian unlocked the box carefully. Inside rested several weathered journals along with an old map of the empire. At first glance, they appeared ordinary. Then I noticed something impossible. The map contained a small estate marked with elegant handwriting. "Carter Residence." My breath caught. Ethan's family estate had never appeared on any official imperial map because it held no political significance. Yet there it was, recorded as though it had always belonged there. Adrian slowly unfolded one of the journals. Most of the pages described routine events from decades earlier until he reached a section where the handwriting abruptly changed. His eyes narrowed slightly before he turned the journal toward me. "Would you read this?" I accepted the book with cautious hands. The ink looked faded, but every word remained perfectly clear. It described an ancient belief that certain people carried an unusual ability to influence the direction of destiny simply by making choices that should never have existed. Those individuals were described not as heroes or rulers but as living crossroads where countless futures could separate. At the bottom of the page, one sentence had been added using noticeably fresher ink than the rest. "When the forgotten one remembers another life, the sleeping paths awaken." A chill traveled through my entire body. Nobody should have known I remembered another life. Nobody except me. I immediately looked toward Adrian, expecting suspicion or confusion, but instead I found quiet concentration. It was obvious he had interpreted the passage differently. To him, it was merely another strange clue connected to the mysterious changes affecting the empire. Relief mixed with guilt settled inside me. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to explain that I came from another world and that every chapter of this kingdom had once existed inside a novel. Yet even I no longer trusted those memories completely. Too many details had changed. Too many new pieces had appeared. The original story was no longer reliable. As the librarian carefully repacked the journals, Adrian rose from his chair and walked toward the window overlooking the palace gardens. After a long silence, he spoke without turning around. "Ethan, I believe someone or something is quietly altering the foundation of our history." He finally faced me again, his expression calm but unmistakably determined. "Until we discover the truth, I would like you to remain close to the palace." Not because I suspect you, but because every answer we uncover somehow leads back to you. Before I could respond, a palace messenger hurried into the room carrying an urgent sealed notice from the Western Province. Adrian broke the seal and read the first page. His composed expression changed for the first time since we met. Entire villages had begun reporting memories of events that had never happened, and every witness described seeing the same unfamiliar silver pendant before their memories changed. The moment you stop running from the unknown is often the moment it begins revealing its secrets. The message from the Western Province changed everything inside the palace before the sun had even reached its highest point. Advisors hurried through the corridors carrying reports from every corner of the empire, while royal historians searched ancient records that seemed to change each time they reopened them. The atmosphere remained orderly because Adrian refused to allow fear to spread. Yet beneath that calm surface, everyone understood they were facing something no generation had ever experienced. I followed Adrian through the Eastern Archive, still trying to process the messenger's report. Entire villages were remembering celebrations that had never taken place, conversations that had never happened, and people who officially did not exist. Every account included one identical detail. Someone had seen a silver pendant before reality itself appeared to shift. My hand instinctively moved beneath my collar where my own pendant rested against my chest. I wanted to remove it, throw it into the nearest river, and pretend none of this had anything to do with me. Yet another part of me understood that doing so would not erase whatever connection already existed. The chief librarian welcomed us into a circular chamber hidden behind the main archive. Unlike the public library, this room contained only a handful of shelves filled with handwritten journals, personal letters from former rulers, and carefully preserved maps dating back hundreds of years. Adrian explained that only a few trusted scholars even knew the chamber existed. If answers remain anywhere, he said quietly, they are most likely here. For the next several hours we examined document after document. Many contained familiar history, but every so often we discovered another impossible change. One journal now described Ethan Carter attending a royal festival as a child, even though Ethan's own memories insisted he had never been invited. Another recorded that the Carter family had once provided advisors to the crown, despite no previous evidence supporting the claim. It felt as though invisible hands were weaving new threads into an old tapestry without removing the original design. The more I read, the more unsettling the pattern became. The rewritten events always made one small adjustment. They moved Ethan closer to Adrian. Never dramatically, never enough to alarm someone reading the records for the first time. Just enough that their lives appeared connected long before they had actually met. Adrian noticed the same pattern. He rested one journal on the table and looked directly at me. This cannot be coincidence anymore. I nodded slowly. It almost feels as though history is trying to convince us that we have always known each other. Instead of dismissing the thought, Adrian remained silent for several moments. Perhaps history is not trying to convince us, he finally replied. Perhaps it is trying to remember something we have forgotten. His answer lingered in my thoughts long after the conversation ended. If he had spoken those words in the original novel, I would have assumed they carried symbolic meaning. Now they sounded frighteningly literal. As evening approached, the chief librarian uncovered a narrow drawer hidden beneath one of the oldest cabinets. Inside rested a collection of sealed letters tied together with faded blue ribbon. None of them listed a sender or recipient. Adrian carefully opened the first envelope. The paper had yellowed with age, yet the ink remained remarkably clear. Every letter described dreams shared by different people across different generations. The dreams always featured the same palace, the same silver pendant, and the same mysterious sentence repeated again and again. The path changes when the forgotten one chooses differently. My pulse quickened. That sentence perfectly described my situation, even though the letters had supposedly been written decades before I was born. Adrian turned another page before quietly reading the final line aloud. When the path awakens, the guardian will recognize the traveler before the traveler recognizes himself. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then the chief librarian frowned as she examined the remaining envelopes. "Your Majesty," she whispered. "There should be 12 letters." Adrian looked inside the box. Only 11 remained. A fresh layer of dust outlined the shape of the missing envelope, proving it had disappeared only recently. Before anyone could search the room, a palace guard hurried into the archive and bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty," he announced, "a traveler has just arrived at the main gate carrying the 12th letter. He insists it belongs to Ethan Carter and says he has spent 20 years waiting for the day it could finally be delivered. Some promises do not wait for the right person. They wait for the right moment." The entire archive fell silent after the guard delivered his message. Even the chief librarian seemed unable to hide her surprise. A traveler carrying a letter addressed to me after waiting for 20 years was impossible by every rule of logic I understood. 20 years ago, I had not existed in this world. Ethan Carter had been a quiet child with no influence, no reputation, and certainly no reason for a stranger to preserve a mysterious letter in his name. Adrian exchanged a brief glance with the librarian before turning toward me. "Would you like me to have the traveler brought here?" he asked. I nodded slowly because refusing would only leave more unanswered questions. A few minutes later, an elderly man entered the chamber wearing a weathered traveling cloak covered with dust from a long journey. His posture remained steady despite his age, and his calm eyes settled on me the instant he crossed the doorway. Instead of bowing to Adrian first, he smiled softly at me as though greeting someone he had expected to meet for many years. Only then did he respectfully acknowledge the Alpha King. From inside a leather satchel, he carefully removed a single cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. The seal did not display a family crest or royal emblem. Instead, it carried the same pattern engraved on the silver pendant resting beneath my collar. My heartbeat grew louder with every passing second. The traveler stepped forward and held out the envelope with both hands. "I was told that one day a young man named Ethan Carter would appear wearing the matching pendant," he said. "Until that day arrived, this letter was never to be opened by anyone else." Adrian looked toward me without saying a word. The choice was mine. I accepted the envelope carefully. The paper felt surprisingly new despite its supposed age, as though time itself had refused to touch it. Breaking the wax seal felt strangely familiar, almost like completing a task I had performed countless times before. Inside rested only a single folded page covered in elegant handwriting. I unfolded it slowly and began reading in silence. The message contained no greeting and no signature. It simply said, "If you are reading this, then you remembered another life before this one. Do not fear the changes surrounding you because they are not your punishment. They are your invitation. The world is not rewriting itself to trap you. It is correcting a story that was never allowed to reach its true ending." I stopped breathing for a moment. Every word seemed directed specifically at me. Adrian quietly observed my expression. "Does the letter explain anything?" he asked. I hesitated. Revealing everything about my previous life still felt impossible, yet hiding the entire message no longer seemed wise. "It says the changes are intentional," I answered honestly. "It suggests that history is correcting itself rather than breaking apart." Adrian considered my answer carefully instead of questioning how such a message could exist. "That matches what we have begun to suspect," he replied. The traveler smiled faintly, almost relieved that the conversation had reached this point. "There is one more thing," he said. "The person who entrusted me with that letter also left a message for His Majesty." Adrian accepted a much smaller folded note. After reading only the first sentence, his usually composed expression shifted into quiet astonishment. He handed the paper to me without hesitation. Written in the same elegant handwriting were the words, "Trust Ethan Carter even when every record tells you not to, because the greatest threat wears the face of perfect history." Before either of us could discuss the meaning, the traveler gently cleared his throat. "I should warn you," he said. "The letters were never meant to prevent the coming trial. They were only meant to help you recognize it." Adrian frowned thoughtfully. "What trial?" The elderly man slowly looked toward the palace windows where the evening sky had begun turning shades of gold and crimson. "Tomorrow morning," Someone will arrive claiming to possess the original history of this kingdom. His voice remained calm, yet every word carried unmistakable certainty. He will know every event that should have happened, every name that should have existed, and every future that was once written. He will convince almost everyone that Ethan Carter is the mistake that must be erased. The only question that matters now is whether your Majesty will believe the records, or the person standing beside you. The hardest choice is not deciding who to trust, but deciding whether you are willing to trust your own heart when every piece of evidence tells you otherwise. Dawn arrived beneath a sky of pale gold, yet the palace felt unusually quiet, as though the entire kingdom had paused to wait for the prediction to unfold. I stood beside one of the eastern windows watching servants prepare the main courtyard while my thoughts circled endlessly around the traveler's warning. If someone truly possessed the original history of this world, then perhaps they knew the novel I remembered even better than I did. Perhaps they knew why Ethan Carter had been forgotten in the first place. Before long, a royal attendant arrived with a polite invitation requesting both Adrian and me to attend an extraordinary council meeting. The wording alone made it clear that this was no ordinary gathering. By the time we entered the Grand Council chamber, nearly every senior noble, military commander, scholar, and advisor had already taken their places. Conversations stopped the moment Adrian walked inside, but I noticed something different from previous days. Instead of pretending I did not exist, countless eyes immediately turned toward me. Curiosity had replaced indifference, and curiosity could become suspicion with frightening speed. Adrian remained calm as always. Rather than allowing me to stand among the attendants, he quietly motioned toward a seat only a short distance from his own. The gesture lasted only a second, yet it sent another wave of whispers through the chamber. I understood exactly what everyone else was thinking. Why would the Alpha King place an overlooked Omega so close during one of the most important meetings in recent memory? Before anyone could ask, the massive doors opened once more. A man dressed in the simple robes of a traveling historian entered with measured confidence. He appeared to be in his early 40s, with neatly tied dark hair and calm gray eyes that carefully studied every face in the room before finally stopping on mine. Instead of surprise, he smiled with quiet certainty. "So," he said softly, "history truly has begun changing." He introduced himself as Julian Ashford, a keeper of forgotten chronicles whose family had preserved an untouched record of the empire for generations. From a carefully protected case, he removed a thick leather-bound manuscript and placed it upon the council table. According to him, the book contained the authentic sequence of events before reality itself began shifting. One by one, he described people, ceremonies, treaties, and royal decisions exactly as I remembered from the novel. Several advisors immediately confirmed the details matched memories they could no longer find inside the rewritten archives. Murmurs filled the chamber. Then Julian calmly turned another page. "There is only one difference between the original history and the present one," he announced. "A person now exists who was never meant to stand within these pages." Without raising his voice, he looked directly at me. "Ethan Carter." The room became perfectly silent. Julian continued speaking with remarkable composure. "Since his unexpected appearance, official records have rewritten themselves. Ancient maps have changed. Personal memories have shifted. Even forgotten legends now point toward him. These are not natural corrections. They are distortions." Every argument sounded logical because I had asked myself those same questions countless times. Adrian did not interrupt. Instead, he allowed Julian to finish completely before asking a single question. "Have you personally met Ethan Carter before today?" Julian answered immediately. "No, Your Majesty." Adrian nodded once. "Then every conclusion you have reached comes from records." "The records are history," Julian replied confidently. Adrian's expression remained thoughtful rather than confrontational. "History is valuable," he agreed, "but records cannot tell me how someone chooses to act." He turned toward the council instead of toward Julian. "During the past several days, Ethan has shown kindness without expecting recognition, answered difficult questions honestly even when uncertainty would have benefited him, and shown concern for this kingdom despite receiving almost nothing from it in return. The chamber grew quieter still. Adrian looked back at Julian with calm conviction. If the records and the person standing before me disagree, I will investigate both. I will not condemn someone simply because a page tells me to. For the first time since entering the room, Julian's confident smile disappeared. He slowly closed the ancient manuscript and spoke almost in a whisper. Then the story has already changed more than I expected. At that exact moment, a brilliant silver glow emerged from beneath my collar. The pendant I had carried since awakening began shining softly, and to everyone's astonishment, an identical light answered from somewhere beneath the palace itself, as though another pendant hidden deep below the ancient foundation had finally awakened after centuries of silence. The ending we fear the most is often only the beginning we never imagined choosing. The silver light beneath my collar continued to pulse with a calm rhythm, neither blinding nor threatening, but unmistakably alive. At the same time, the answering glow deep beneath the palace spread through the ancient stone floor in delicate lines that resembled streams of moonlight flowing beneath clear water. No one in the council chamber spoke. Even Julian Ashford lowered his manuscript as every eye turned toward the marble beneath our feet. Adrian rose from his seat without hesitation. His expression remained steady, not because he understood what was happening, but because he refused to allow uncertainty to become panic. "Open the lower sanctuary," he instructed the royal guards. "If the palace has been protecting something for centuries, then it is time we learn why." Hidden stairways beneath the council chamber led us into a forgotten section of the palace that none of the current advisors had ever entered. The chief librarian quietly admitted that old blueprints mentioned sealed halls beneath the foundation, yet every generation had assumed they were only symbolic additions to the architectural plans. As we descended, the silver glow became brighter until we reached a circular chamber unlike anything I had seen in the novel or in the rewritten records. At its center stood a simple stone pedestal holding another silver pendant that looked identical to the one resting against my chest. The moment I stepped closer, both pendants shone together before slowly settling into a gentle warmth. Instead of changing the room, they changed us. Memories began surfacing inside my mind, not replacing my own, but standing beside them. I remembered reading the novel in my previous life, but I also remembered moments that belonged to Ethan. I remembered being a lonely child wandering the palace gardens, quietly leaving flowers beside forgotten memorials because no one else visited them anymore. I remembered Adrian as a young prince offering thanks to an unseen helper who had anonymously restored damaged library books after every storm. We had crossed paths more than once as children, yet history had gradually erased every meeting until only strangers remained. Beside me, Adrian closed his eyes briefly before opening them with quiet realization. "I remember," he whispered. "Not everything, only fragments, but they are real." He looked toward me with the same calm sincerity that had defined every conversation since we first met. The first time I thanked someone for returning a lost lantern to my younger cousin was not in the royal garden this week. It happened years ago. You were there then as well. I smiled softly because the memory had appeared inside my own mind at the same moment. Neither of us had been mistaken. We had simply been forgotten. The elderly traveler, who had silently accompanied the group, stepped forward with peaceful satisfaction. "The sanctuary does not create destiny," he explained. "It restores forgotten truth. The world was never trying to force two lives together. It was trying to return stolen memories so people could choose freely instead of following an incomplete story." Julian slowly approached the pedestal, gently placing his ancient manuscript beside it. As soon as the book touched the stone, the faded writing began changing one final time. Entire chapters quietly rewrote themselves without hurry or spectacle. When the light faded, Julian opened the first page and smiled with humble relief. "There was never one correct history," he admitted. "There were always many possible futures. We simply mistook the first version we recorded for the only one that deserved to exist." The burden I had carried since awakening finally disappeared. I no longer needed to force the original plot back into place because there had never been a single path that everyone was obligated to follow. Adrian stepped beside me, not as a king issuing commands, but as someone choosing trust over certainty. "The Empire has protected its history for generations," he said. "Now it is time we protect its future instead." The council unanimously agreed to preserve both the original records and the rewritten ones, allowing future generations to understand that history was shaped not only by destiny, but also by compassion, courage, and the choices ordinary people made every day. Weeks later, the palace gardens bloomed brighter than ever. Children laughed beside the fountains, scholars debated new discoveries without fear, and forgotten names once erased from official records returned to their rightful places. I stood beneath the same cherry trees where everything had first begun, realizing that I had entered this world believing survival was enough. Instead, I had discovered something far greater. A story does not become meaningful because it follows the ending everyone expects. It becomes meaningful because the people inside it choose kindness even when they are free to choose anything else. And for the first time, neither Ethan Carter nor Adrian Blackwood needed destiny to define who they would become, because together they had already written a future that belonged entirely to them.